Thank you very much. Thank you, President Kim, Ambassador Xing, Ambassador Ma, Professor King, and Professor Kong. It's my pleasure, it's my great honor to speak in Korea Foundation today, and I will briefly introduce the approaches and the challenges of public diplomacy in China. I think this is a very important, very new, but very complex conception in China in recent years. And I'm one of the groups who worked for public diplomacy research very early in China, but the time is just for the last 10 years. But before that, there were huge members of persons who were working for public diplomacy in contemporary China for more than 50 to 60 years since the new China was founded. Before 1990s, it was called external propaganda, which in Chinese is called 外宣, how to explain China to abroad in Chinese communist system. So I think in the late 1990s, the public diplomacy existed in Chinese academia research, and during the first years of the 21st century, we understand that public diplomacy is very important, very new, very charming conception that can accompany with China's rising. So as I said, that public diplomacy is a long time working, but new conception in Chinese professionals. I will show you a very new work which raised a huge debate in China for China's public diplomacy work. This is a video which showed in the early months of last year in New York, the Times Square. The video was accompanied by the very important state visit of President Hu Jintao to the United States, which was formulated and created by the Information Office of the State Council. This is a very important department of China to do the work of public diplomacy, because theoretically, the Information Office of the State Council charged all the work of foreign correspondents in China. This video lasted 2 minutes, but it raised the debating for 2 months. Let's see. From the January to the end of February of 2011, the video showed again and again in the screen of Times Square in New York. The people who give high praise to this national advertisement, as we call it, say that this is the first time that Chinese people, common person, appeared in national advertisement instead of the party. So we are very seldom to see that very common face of Chinese people, not the Great Wall, not the Forbidden City, appeared in to explain that the contemporary China. But the people who criticize this advertisement raised the question: can you recognize the ending finger in this national advertisement. Maybe to American, they just recognized Yao Ming, who is a very important basketball player in United States, playing basketball in NBA of the United States. But the other person, they cannot understand that. And they will have the feeling that, oh, Chinese is coming. Because in the so-called World Cross, the Times Square, you saw Chinese appeared again and again and again. So totally we calculate 8,400 times appeared in the screen of Times Square. They will shock the local American to see that it's not a national advertisement, but it's just like a symbolic to see. Now you see Chinese is invading New York. So this debating existed for quite a long time, but we give very high price we give very positive evaluation to this debating, not this advertisement, because we think during this debating, Chinese people understand that if we want to explain the contemporary China as a work of public diplomacy to the world, we should understand more than we should understand more of the content than the way that we should use to explain China. I will just very quickly feedback the advertisement, and let's go back to the history of Chinese public diplomacy, which was exists now. I think the formulation of public diplomacy in contemporary China need to understand the 5 important time points. The first time since 1840, the modernization and the nationalization of China, of modern China, give high influence to the contemporary public diplomacy, because this year is the first time that foreigners invade the mainland of China, which formulate the so-called nationalism of contemporary China. Now, when you go to China, you will very frequently heard a newspaper which called Global Times. They take this newspaper as a flag of Chinese nationalism because it criticized the many countries during the conflict, the border conflict or the international competition between China and other countries. But this newspaper is a very popular newspaper in China, even in young intelligence. The question is why? Why they raise the flag of nationalism, but they still welcomed in Chinese citizens. So the problem is that the nationalism still influenced the public diplomacy. China like to show the positive face very much to the international audience, but we will have a very long time debating with the foreign media, foreign correspondent, why you just focus on the negative face of China, but you ignore the positive. Because sometimes we found that the modernization motivation and nationalism is a very important part of Chinese public diplomacy now. And then the next time will be 1949, as you know very well. The international relationship strategy of Chinese Communist Party from 1949. They like to be independent for the first 30 or 40 years. And then they try to change the face to be more open-minded to the world. So from 1978, Chinese people opened the gate, opened the process, historic process of reforming and opening. They found that the international opinion circumstance is very important to China when Chinese people or Chinese government try to cooperate with other countries. During 1978, there is a very important word which was raised by Mr. Deng Xiaoping, and last until now, the word is 韬光养晦. I don't know whether some Chinese scholar can understand this word. Until 2009, Chinese scholars still argued how to translate Tao Guang Yang Hui into English. Maybe some Korean friend can translate into Korea. It's very Eastern cultural conception. But if we translate Tao Guang Yang Hui into hitting the light, they will give the international audience a kind of emotion that Chinese people have ambition, but they hide the ambition. They just try to do some secret work, and they need time. And accompanied with Tao Guang Yang Hui, the foreign relations strategy, there is another time conception which was declined during the Chinese Communist Party's 16th Congress, that we faced more than 10 years strategic challenge time. The exact time is from 2001, which was after the September 11 incident. And the Chinese people find that the United States focusing the international strategy in the Middle East and in Asia, there was a comparatively peaceful and stable situation. So China faced a very good international circumstance, and we can do more cooperate with the huge countries in the world. So that's why in the last 10 years we heard the conception G2, which Chinese did not want to acknowledge this conception. We don't think that China is one country that we can be accompanied or can be compared with the United States. But to international opinion, that G2 means that two countries which can influence international affairs, one of the biggest developed country and one of the biggest developing country. So international opinion circumstance played a very important role during the time after opening and reforming. The next time point is 1989. As you know, the Tiananmen incident happened in June 4th. After that, the international opinion circumstance changed totally. And the positive reporting and the positive image of China disappeared just in one night. And we faced a very tough situation that many criticized to Chinese human rights, to Chinese Communist Party's political system, the ruling system. And we found more and more crises happened during the 1990s, like Taiwan crisis, like human rights crisis, like religion crisis. And we also have some 3T situation, means Taiwan, trade, Tibet, 3T situation between China-US relationship. The Chinese government tried to devote to solve this kind of negative situation. And they did very important work, and I think the conclusion is much more better than 1989 because we faced the 2008 Olympics. This 2008 Olympics is a very important forward process of public diplomacy because we still think that 2008 is a very important changing milestone in the history of contemporary China because we found that in 2008 some new regulation came out. The new regulation of foreign correspondent work in China, which means that the foreign correspondent can feel free to interview any people theoretically in China if they just get the permission of the person who they want to interview. They need not to get permission from the local government or central government. This new regulation gives a very important overview or draw a very important frame of China's new law to foreign correspondent in the coming years. So after 2008, we found that foreign correspondent is more and more active in China. And after 2008, there is another new things which changed very quickly. This is a new media, like Chinese Weibo, Chinese Twitter, Chinese microblog, Chinese Twitter. This new media system give more content to Chinese common people. or we can say they trade a Chinese citizen society. The Chinese citizen society appeared during Chinese foreign policy making process, give high pressure or positive influence to Chinese foreign policy making. So until now, when Chinese diplomats try to get interview whenever from Chinese media or foreign media, the first expression or the first idea they will think is how Chinese people will react from my words. So in the crisis in Huangyan Dao recent days, why some people think the Chinese foreign minister is so tough, so strong, compared with another crisis, Meijijiao crisis, happened in 1998, also between China and the Philippines. This time, Chinese slogan of the spokesperson of Ministry of Foreign Affairs is much more tough. They must care about the reaction between Chinese domestic opinion. So China is changing very quickly. It's not just like a situation one power can control the political system. This is like a different kinds of department or different kinds of interest group play games in Chinese policy, including public diplomacy. So if you check the different departments who have relationship or concerned about public diplomacy, you will find that, like the list of Chinese organizations. Some organization or some department is very important, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They have office of the Office of Public Diplomacy in Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It existed for more than 20 years, since the early years of 1990s. But in the first 10 years, the Office of Public Diplomacy in MFA, they just do the work to introduce Chinese foreign policy to domestic audience. And from the early years of the 21st century, they changed. They changed that to do the work not only to domestic audience, but also to foreign audience. So now it's like in China, we also have an ambassador who in charge of public diplomacy. The next will be Information Office of the State Council. This is a very important and very active department who working for public diplomacy. The very famous director of this office is Mr. Zhao Qizheng. I think he will speak in the in our Korea Foundation in the future months. He is a very active person, and he did the director position from 1998 to 2007, I think. So in 8 years, he opened a very important system in China, which is called spokesperson system. Now, China's government spokesperson, we can say nearly all chaired by the Information Office of State Council. Of course, Tsinghua University involved this training program in a very early year. And the Minister of Culture, who in charge of all the exhibition abroad. So the source of exhibition, the source of players, the source of shows coming from the Ministry of Culture. And you will find that like the Culture Year between China and Russia, the Culture Year between China and South Korea, all in charge of by the Ministry of Culture. Ministry of Education is a ministry, looks like have far distance from public diplomacy, but it charged a very important institute which is called the Confucius Institute. The Confucius Institute was charged by the Ministry of Education, and some of the person who working in Confucius Institute was selected by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's like a cooperation group, but mostly charged by the Ministry of Education. The China International Publication Group published all the English textbook or the English introduction of China to a foreign audience. So when you were invited to Chinese embassy in Seoul, you will find that huge numbers of introduction of China, like textbook, like handbook, or like the like different posters all published by the Chinese International Publication Group. But China International Publication Group are also include some work of Information Office of State Council. They cooperate together. The other corporation, Guangdian Zongju, which in charge of China's domestic TV or domestic publication, they do some supporting work to public diplomacy. And People's Congress and the People's Consultative Committee, these two institute are legal institute of Chinese political system. They are very active in public diplomacy. Now, Mr. Zhao Qizheng is the spokesperson of Political Consultative Committee, who raised the first journal, academic journal of public diplomacy in China. All this, the former list is the Chinese legal system or Chinese political system, and there are several independent institute or independent organization which join the public diplomacy work, like NGO supported by government. You will find that the China's Human Rights Foundation, which was supported by Information Office. You will find that Chinese Religion Foundation, which was supported by the Chinese Religion Committee. And you will find that the commercial group or state-run enterprises. The state-run enterprises recent years are very active in public diplomacy because they invested in some developing countries. And I will mention later that in Africa, now public diplomacy is a very important work which was charged by Sino-Petro-Oil, some kinds of state-owned enterprises. Of course, we also have some Chinese academia, like between China and Japan, we have an academic dialogue we call Second Chain Dialogue, just focus on historic common sense and historic Confucians. So the two countries have this dialogue 1 or 2 times every year to try to clarify some important historic facts in the invading years during the Second World War. This is a kind of public diplomacy. So how to understand that public diplomacy in contemporary China? To Chinese scholar, I think public diplomacy means 3 things. The first thing means that the part of public diplomacy is one part of national soft power. For example, Confucius Institute. I don't know whether you noticed the news recent days that American Congress give a alum letter to China, some Chinese Confucius Institute employees coming from China that you should obey American law. And this raised a very important debating between U.S. and China to say how to define Confucius Institute in United States. At last, the Department of State of the United States said that, we should double-check the alum letter. And we welcomed Confucius Institute to join the local education of United States. But this debating means one thing. This debating means some American congressmen noticed that the cultural influence of Confucius Institute in United States. They worry about that. They are arguing about that, and they try to balance the cultural influence or potential cultural influence of Confucius Institute. Though Confucius Institute still have some problem, I will mention later. The second part, I think public diplomacy is one part of positive national image building. So, for example, I just showed the advertisement in Times Square in New York in last year. And from this kinds of work, we found that whenever any kinds of department who are interested in public diplomacy, they take public diplomacy as positive, not objective. These two words are different in national image building. We focus on how to build positive image of China. Positive means that we like to show good face. We like to give some interesting some attractive things to foreigners. But positive is also a very important political slogan in Chinese political system. Sometimes we will say that if you want positive image, give them truth. This is a kind of way to try to persuade or try to push Chinese officials to be more open-minded, to be more frank, to give facts, to be ambitious, to have press conference in some typical crisis, like Tibet crisis in 2008 or Xinjiang crisis in 2009. And you will find that after the Olympics, China tried to be in the first time to announce some facts during some crisis. The third thing, public diplomacy is part of citizen identity. I should say from 1840, during the past more than 100 years, Chinese people try to find who we are for quite a long time. Public diplomacy is a kind of way to help Chinese people to identify themselves. Because China's developing is just the economic developing. During the economic developing, we found that the culture and the society modernization is a very tough work for quite a long time. How to balance the commercial society and the traditional Chinese society? We have to balance the two things in branding China. So sometimes we will find that China can give huge money on advertising, on branding China, but they don't know how to find important finger, how to find important symbolic to express China. For example, we have two debatings, very interesting debating, but lasted quite a long time. Dragon. Dragon is a very important, a very good symbolic of China in Chinese history. But when Chinese diplomats try to explain that we are sons of dragon to Western audience, the problem is coming. In Western mysteries, in Western myths, dragon looks like ugly, a kind of tough animal, a kind of very, it's a beast. It's not a good animal. It's not a good company with person. They protest the wealth. They are very the things, the symbolic looks totally different with Chinese myths. So how to explain that we are kinds of sons of dragon? Some scholars raised that in 2006, before Olympics, we should change dragon to panda. But Chinese audience cannot accept that we are the sons of panda. So this debating means culture difference, but lasts quite a long time. But we will ask you the question, why don't you have confidence when you try to explain your culture to foreigners? So we have to follow the steps of Western modernization. Some scholars in Singapore National University raised the question in the last year in a conference in Beijing to say that China did nothing. But we found that in the past 10 years, now a space of branding is smaller and smaller. Now answer is why? We did nothing, but the economic is bigger and bigger. But we haven't opened the space. We haven't opened the space of Chinese totally development and not just economic. So this is 3 parts. The challenge of public diplomacy in contemporary China, I will be very quickly to show these 4 things. Of course, we understand that the agenda setting of global media to China is a very tough situation. For example, I will show you one thing. This newspaper, last year, China Indian, the newspaper, the report coming from International Herald Tribune, which was formed by New York Times, Indian to play T-72 tanks on border. So the picture is very interesting. Lhasa, Beijing, we will be there. this is an encouraging word in Indian military training position. So this is what we call that negative report. And you will find another interesting thing is that during the demonstration in Egypt in last year, some person who raised Chinese words to ask President Mubarak to leave out. The person, I think, he get education in Confucius Institution in Egypt. This is soft power. I don't know, but he raised this Chinese slogan. It's not just a show to President Mubarak, but the Chinese slogan to Chinese correspondent. The second, relationship with neighborhoods in peaceful rising. In Chinese, we call it peaceful rising. This is two demonstrations, one in Vietnam, the second in Philippines, both related with South China Sea crisis. And as we know that in China's neighborhood problem, we have some sudden or random crisis that will influence the common relationship between China and the neighbor countries. The third will be domestic public opinion role in foreign policy making process and and the new media and the national image. This is a disaster which happened in Southeast China in the last year. 19 Chinese crews were killed by the local criminal. And China forced Thailand, Burma, Laos to join to open a joint investigation and finally catch the criminal in Laos. And the later one will be a very important case of a domestic case and related with foreign relations. Because in the last year, in 2011, there is some accident of Chinese school bus in poor countryside. Like some school bus, some pupil school has no school bus, so they have to hire some very local, very common, even very small car to carry the students. And accident happened, many students died. During that time, China donate 50 school buses to Mauritania in Egypt. So this raised a very important wave of crisis to criticize the Chinese foreign ministry, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to say why you donate school buses to foreign countries, but you ignored that even Chinese domestic person still have not enough school buses to use. So this case lasted 2 months in last year. New media, Weibo, play more and more important role in Chinese public diplomacy. So it forced Chinese people, when we talk about public diplomacy, theoretically we understand that public diplomacy is kinds of diplomacy. So it means that we have to face the two foreign audience. But this situation means that half of our work of public diplomacy have to split into domestic persons to try to make domestic persons to understand why we have this kind of foreign policy and try to persuade them to support that. I will quick. So I give some time to Q&A. Problem of public diplomacy in contemporary China. We're debating several things. The first thing is content of public diplomacy. We should use historic approach or realistic approach. Both of either of these approach have examples. If you see the advertisement or if you see the introduction of 2000 Olympic Games, you will find the historic approach. You will find the Forbidden City, you will find the Great Wall, you will find a very powerful symbolic but few person. But if you saw the Shanghai World Expo, you found that more and more persons' face existed in realistic approach of China's public diplomacy. China like to select more and more selected contemporary situation to show that what China is. The second is symbolic, man or order. For quite a long time, because of Chinese political tradition and the Chinese culture tradition, we like to explain order first. So if you read a Chinese public diplomacy book, which named China, it's like a handbook to introduce China. The first chapter always be China is a kind of country which was controlled by, which was led by Chinese Communist Party and multi-party cooperation system, something like that. But from 2007, we changed the way of writing to say China is a kind of country that full of person. We have the most population, but the population looks like something, this thing, other thing, or another thing. Looks like people to be the first chapter of Chinese public diplomacy. The direction always be debating is in Eastern approach or Western approach. I think in the past, in a time during 1949 to 1979, in the last 30 years, we have Eastern approach. We like to build a relationship between Africa and Asia countries. So the public diplomacy approach is Eastern approach. But after reforming the opening, we change the direction. We pay much more attention on how Europe see China. So we do many work to try to cooperate or try to persuade the foreign and the international media correspondent and try to invite them to report China more. It means that in some meaning, China ignored the relationship between Africa and the neighbors, which lead some negative report and negative image in the past 2 or 3 years. So in 2010 and 2011, there is a very important phenomenon in Africa that the local newspaper, the local television give more negative report to China, even to Chinese enterprises who invested in Africa and some of Chinese political system. And some president candidate in Zambia who criticized China can be elected as the current president. He raised the flag of anti-China, anti-Chinese businessmen. So it alarmed us that public diplomacy should be much more balanced, not just a Western approach. And then the audience, as I just mentioned, domestically or foreigners, this both direction influence Chinese foreign policy making more and more tough. The last thing, I would mention some of the influence of public diplomacy in China-Korea relationship. I think we have a very good basement of public diplomacy between now two countries, like Korean drama, like Korean culture influenced Chinese, even young generation very much. And theoretically and very seriously speaking, we have not very serious historic problem between now two countries. So in East Asia, I think South Korea and China have very good, I can say, the best basement of public diplomacy. And the second thing, I think there is increasing latent capability besides with increasing trade between two countries. These two countries have more opportunity on trade, on business, and on technology cooperation. So, which means that Chinese people, when they visit Korea, they want to understand more about the advanced technology, and they want to get more advanced management experience. These two things, culture and economy, shape very good basement of public diplomacy. So we still have huge space of public diplomacy. But I think the uncertainty of public diplomacy between now two countries is crisis. So sometimes with the crisis approach will change in short time of both image in now two countries. They played a very important role in both public opinion. I think three things will be potential crisis. One is the relationship with North Korea. Even in China, I think now the relation between China and North Korea is a very important topic, debating, freely in academia though you heard about a very stable slogan in the government, but in academia, in public opinion, many people in internet, many people discuss about how we face a new relationship between China and North Korea. I think North Korea, including North Korea defenders, will be a very important session to raise the crisis. The second thing will be the sea resources debating, or Su Yanjiao case. In China, we call it the Su Yanjiao case, the sea policeman and the fishermen's conflict. This conflict existed for quite a long time, and in last year, because of the fishermen killed the sea policeman in the Yellow Sea, so Chinese people try to discuss about that, and I think the nationalism flag raised again, but it disappeared very quickly because of more international news came out, like Syria international news, like Huangyan Island crisis. But in some time, there is not big news. This kind of crisis will be a very uncertain problem to influence now two countries. And the third thing, I think, is some historic debating. Something is true, but something is fake. I don't know whether you know, one of my students who did the research of 2005 and 6 Global Times reporting on South Korea. She analyzed the data, and she found that the cultural and historic debating, like the coming festival, traditional festival, which belongs to and who have the right to ask for the World Heritage right of this coming festival, of some arts, or of something like that. They will be a very uncertain session of public diplomacy in China. And last thing, I think we have very little designable symbolic to draw the overview of PD between us. As I remember that the United States raised a very important, a very famous lady whose name is Michelle Guan. She's a skating player as the public diplomacy ambassador to China. And she visited many cities. She played with Chinese elites and the Chinese young generation. And she gave very high prize in China. And she tried to explain that American-born Chinese can play a very important role in American political life and American cultural life. This kind of very stable, very designable symbolic of public diplomacy between our two countries, I think is very little. So both China and South Africa need to think about that who is the most welcome person in both countries. I think these 4 things will influence the future public diplomacy in between our two countries. I think this is a very brief understanding of public diplomacy in China, and I just listed several things. Welcome your commentaries and welcome your questions. Thank you very much.